Macbeth, Act III, Scene 1. It is in this act that we move into the chaos phase of the play. We see Macbeth's character decline even further as he becomes a cruel and tyrannical leader, a far cry from the brave, noble and valiant gentleman that he was described as in Act I. At the end of Act II, we had the character of Macduff already becoming suspicious of Macbeth. In Act III, Scene 1, we have another character, Banquo, voicing his suspicions about Macbeth. Remember, in the play so far, Macbeth has been a colleague, even a friend of Banquo. But time has moved on since the end of Act II, and Banquo is growing suspicious. In Scene 1, we are back in Macbeth's castle, and to begin with, only Banquo enters the stage, and he says this: "Thou hast it now, King, Cawdor, Glamis all, as the weird women promised, and I fear thou playedest most foully for it. Yet it was said it should not stand in thy posterity, but that myself should be the root and father of many kings. If there come truth from them, as upon thee, Macbeth, their speeches shine, why, by the verities on thee made good, may they not be my oracles as well and set me up in hope? But hush, no more." So Scene 1 begins with this short soliloquy of Banquo in which he is reflecting on the fact that he believes that Macbeth has behaved in an immoral manner in order to become king. And the key quotation for that is where Banquo says, "I fear thou playedest most foully for it." When he talks about Macbeth playing most foully, without actually saying it explicitly, he, talking to himself, is hinting that he believes that Macbeth has murdered Duncan to get to the throne. Now, Banquo has no concrete evidence for this. These are only his suspicions. But it is significant that somebody who has been as close to Macbeth as Banquo has, that he is now suspicious of his former friend. "I fear thou playedest most foully for it." Despite this, Banquo takes some comfort, yet it was said it should not stand in thy posterity. In other words, Banquo realises that even if Macbeth has behaved in an immoral and criminal manner in order to get to the throne, Macbeth's power won't last, because Macbeth has no son to pass on the kingship to. He has no heirs, and so therefore any ambition that Macbeth had will not lead to any lasting fulfilment, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. So it's a reminder by Shakespeare through the character of Banquo that Macbeth may well have achieved his aims and ambitions. He has got the crown, but the name Macbeth will never remain on the throne because Macbeth has got no one to pass the title to. We're also reminded at this point that Banquo, as he puts it, will myself be the root and father of many kings. If the witch's prophecies are true, and he acknowledges that they have been true for Macbeth, why won't they come true for me? If the witches spoke truly, then I will be the root and father of many kings. It's my descendants who will rule Scotland in the future. Banquo has to stop talking at this point. That's why he says hush no more, because we're told in the stage direction that there is a sound of a trumpet. Macbeth enters, notice, as king. Lady Macbeth as queen. We have Lennox, Ross, and other lords and attendants. By Banquo speaking openly, in the way that he's done, albeit privately, if that were overheard, then it's very likely that he would be executed for speaking out against his king. So he's got to stay quiet at this point. He wants to keep his thoughts hidden, which is why he basically tells himself to shut up the minute that Macbeth and company arrive on the stage. Macbeth's first line in this scene: "Here's our chief guest," and he's talking about Banquo, of course. By the end of this act, there is going to be a banquet, a celebratory feast, to celebrate Macbeth's coronation. Now, this line is highly ironic, because Macbeth describes Banquo as our chief guest at the feast that he's planning. But at this point, and we're going to be very aware of this by the end of this scene, Macbeth is already planning Banquo's murder. So to his face, Macbeth is flattering Banquo, "Here's our chief guest," but in private, he's planning Banquo's murder. More about that very shortly. Lady Macbeth says, "If he had been forgotten, it had been as a gap in our great feast, an all thing unbecoming. It would be very embarrassing if Banquo had not been invited to our feast." Now, I want to make an important point here, which will become more apparent in later scenes. We are slowly but surely seeing the growing divide between Macbeth and his wife, because at this point, Lady Macbeth does not know that her husband is planning to have Banquo killed. This is really significant because remember, Lady Macbeth was the one who encouraged her husband to keep his thoughts hidden, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. Here, Macbeth is not only deceiving Banquo, he is also deceiving his wife as well, because in front of her, he's inviting Banquo to the feast, and yet he's planning to have him murdered, but he's not shared this with his wife. He is deceiving her as well. He is keeping secrets from her. But as I say, that becomes more apparent in later scenes. Macbeth says to Banquo, "Tonight we hold a solemn supper, sir, and I'll request your presence." Tonight we are holding a feast, a solemn supper, as Macbeth describes it, and I want you there. I'll request your presence. Now, you may notice that in these lines, Shakespeare employs the poetic and literary device of sibilance, the repetition of that soft s, that soft hissing sound. Solemn supper, sir. We've even got the sibilance combined with alliteration here. Tonight we hold a solemn supper, sir, and I'll request your presence. Going back to that line about being the serpent, Macbeth even speaks in a serpent-like way here. We have this hissing sound, and remember that in Christian ideology, the serpent is a representative of the devil. So Macbeth speaks in this serpent-like manner here. I think this is very deliberate on Shakespeare's part. It is showing us through Macbeth's use of language here the evil that lurks beneath this facade, this disguise of civility and pleasantness. Banquo cannot turn down an invitation from the king. And yet I want you to understand that what Banquo says next, Banquo is also being deceptive. He says, "Let your highness command upon me, to the which my duties are with a most indissoluble tie forever knit." To Macbeth's face, he seems to be promising loyalty. But as is going to become clear, Banquo is not loyal to Macbeth. He's already voiced his suspicions, and he has plans of his own. What occurs next is a conversation between Macbeth and Banquo that on the surface just looks like polite conversation. But Macbeth is asking the questions that he asks for a very specific reason. Macbeth asks Banquo, "Ride you this afternoon? Are you going horse riding later on?" To which Banquo replies, "Aye, my good lord. Yes, in other words." Macbeth says, We should have else desired your good advice, which still have been both grave and prosperous in this day's council, but we'll take tomorrow. In that part of the speech, Macbeth is hinting that after this little meeting that they're having, Macbeth is going off to have a discussion with his advisors and his lords in order to oversee the politics of running the kingdom. And he's saying, oh, it's a shame, Banquo, that you're going out riding. I really would have liked to have heard your advice at the meeting that we're about to go to, but never mind. You go off and I'll speak to you tomorrow instead. That, of course, is ironic because Macbeth is planning that Banquo will be dead by tomorrow. He then asks the seemingly innocuous question, "Is it far you ride?" Banquo replies, "As far, my lord, as will fill up the time twixt this and supper. Go not my horse the better, I must become a borrower of the night for a dark hour or twain." These seemingly polite and trivial questions from Macbeth, what he's trying to do is he's trying to find out what Banquo is planning to do and where he's going, so that he knows where to send his hired killers. All of these questions that he's asking to Banquo is so that Macbeth can plan for Banquo's murder, so that he can tell his hired murderers where to find him. Banquo's reply is important. When Macbeth says, "Is it far you ride? Are you riding far?" Banquo says, "I'll ride as far as will fill up the time between now and when the feast begins." But it's this line which is particularly important. "Go not my horse the better, I must become a borrower of the night for a dark hour or twain." Essentially, what Banquo is saying here is this. When I go out riding, don't worry if I'm an hour or two late for the feast, because it might be that my horse doesn't behave very well, or it doesn't ride particularly strongly. I might be an hour or two late for the feast. That's what he means when he says, I must become a borrower of the night for a dark hour or twain, a dark hour or two. The reason that I hone in on this line and suggest it is so important is because what Banquo's doing here is he's trying to buy himself some time, because I very much believe that what Banquo is planning to do is not to just go out riding for fun. What he's planning to do is escape from Scotland. He is planning to leave Scotland because he's frightened about what Macbeth might do. Remember, he has these suspicions about Macbeth now. So what he's saying to Macbeth is, don't worry if I'm an hour or two late for the feast. Why is he saying that? Because it buys him time to get away. He's trying not to be too suspicious. He's trying not to draw attention to himself. So, by saying to Macbeth, I might be an hour or two late for the feast, Macbeth is not then going to be too worried, so Banquo thinks, if he doesn't show up on time. That way he can get further away from Macbeth's castle and hopefully flee to safety. So that's what I think that line is all about. And the fact that he's planning to leave Scotland, I think is borne out by something that happens in a few scenes' time. But more about that when we get there. Macbeth gives Banquo a command which is again ironic because Macbeth does not plan that Banquo should ever be able to carry out this command. Macbeth says to him, "Fail not our feast." It's like saying, make sure you attend our party. But as I've said, he's planning that Banquo will never be there. This is all for the benefit of all the other people who are standing round. Remember, Lady Macbeth is there. Various lords are there. Publicly, Macbeth is giving Banquo a command that he must not be late for the party. But privately, he's planning something very different. Banquo himself is being deceptive when he says, "My lord, I will not." Banquo does not plan to be at that feast, but publicly he's accepting Macbeth's invitation. Then Macbeth says, We hear our bloody cousins are bestowed in England and in Ireland, not confessing their cruel parricide, filling their hearers with strange invention. But of that tomorrow, when therewithal we shall have cause of state craving us jointly. Hie you to horse, adieu, till you return at night. What Macbeth is doing here is he is spreading the idea that Malcolm and Donalbain were responsible for murdering their father. When he talks about our bloody cousins, he is of course referring to Malcolm and Donalbain. We know that when he talks about the fact that they are bestowed in England and in Ireland, we know from the end of Act II that that's where Malcolm and Donalbain have gone. Parricide is murder of a parent, and he's saying that they are not confessing their cruel parricide. So Macbeth is shifting suspicion away from himself by blaming Malcolm and Donalbain. Incredibly immoral. He then asks this question: goes Fleance with you? Remember that Fleance is one of Banquo's sons. Macbeth wants to know if Fleance is going riding with his father too. Banquo replies, "Aye, my good lord, our time does call upon us." The fact that Banquo is taking his son Fleance riding is another piece of evidence that suggests to me that he's trying to escape from Scotland. He wants to take his son with him to keep his son safe. Macbeth, again being deceptive, seeming to be polite and civil, says, "I wish your horses swift and sure of foot, and so I do commend you to their backs. Farewell." Basically, I hope you ride safely, enjoy your ride, off you go. And that is indeed what Banquo does. He leaves the stage. Macbeth then turns to the assembled gathering. "Let every man be master of his time till 7 at night. To make society the sweeter welcome, we will keep ourself till supper time alone. While then, God be with you." Macbeth dismisses all of the lords at this point. He says you are free to do what you want until 7 o'clock tonight. And the excuse that he gives is that if they spend some time apart between now and the feast, society will be a sweeter welcome. They will enjoy each other's company more if they've been away from each other for a few hours. They'll have more to talk about. It will be a more enjoyable feast. I want you to notice the stage direction then says, "Exit all but Macbeth and a servant." When Macbeth says, "While then, God be with you," everyone leaves the stage apart from Macbeth and a servant. Why is that significant? Well, it's because of this. The reason that Macbeth wants to be alone is he's about to have a meeting with the two men that he's going to hire to have Banquo killed. So he's doing it in secret. Why do I draw attention to what is quite an obvious fact? Because it's the fact that Lady Macbeth is also dismissed along with the rest of the lords. In some of the best adaptations of Shakespeare that I've seen, in the performance of this particular speech, when Macbeth says, "While then, God be with you," everyone leaves the stage apart from Lady Macbeth because she doesn't think she's being dismissed. But the actor playing Macbeth then gives her such a look as if to say, "I meant you as well," that she, rather sheepishly and rather embarrassed, has to leave the stage as well. It is crucial that Lady Macbeth is not on stage with Macbeth at this point, because it is a further example, one of the first actually, in the play, that Macbeth is growing apart from his wife. Remember that he would not have murdered Duncan without her support. He needed her support on the night of the murder. But we've got to the stage in Macbeth's character development where he is now confident to act alone, to act independently, and she is dismissed along with everybody else. Macbeth calls the servant over, and he says, "Sirrah, a word with you. Attend those men our pleasure." He's talking about the men that he's hired to kill Banquo. The servant says, "They are, my lord, without the palace gate. Yes, they're waiting for you just outside the palace." Macbeth commands the servant, "Bring them before us." This leaves Macbeth alone on stage in order to share some of his private thoughts and, I would suggest, fears with the audience. Macbeth begins this soliloquy by saying, "To be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. To be king is nothing, but to be safely king." What he means by this, I need to be securely king, or the position is worthless. An important analytical point for you to note as a student is this. One of the issues that we know Shakespeare deals with in this play is the idea of ambition and power. Now remember that Macbeth, as a tragic hero, has the fatal flaw of ambition. The way that Shakespeare explores power through this concept, in Macbeth's own words here, Macbeth is saying, "I am now king, but unless I am secure on the throne, being king is pointless." The issue Shakespeare is raising is this idea of Macbeth wanted to become king, but this ambition that he's had to become king, once he's got the power, he doesn't really know what to do with it. The thing that Macbeth wanted was the power and position of the kingship, but he's never thought beyond what he will do once he becomes king. Remember that in his soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth even reflected on the fact that ambition alone was not motive enough for wanting to kill Duncan and become king, and now he's finding out he has what he wanted, but it has not brought him any satisfaction, and he doesn't really know what to do with the power. And the reason it's brought him no satisfaction is because he does not feel safe and secure on the throne. This next line, really important and one to commit to memory. "Our fears in Banquo stick deep. I am frightened of Banquo." This is the point in the play where we really see Macbeth's paranoia starting to develop. He is frightened of Banquo because of the prophecies that the witches gave about Banquo's children becoming kings in the future, and he's going to reflect more on that as this speech continues. I'd also like you to note what Macbeth says next. "Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared." Macbeth reveals that one of the reasons he's frightened of Banquo is that Banquo has natural authority. Banquo is noble and loyal. He has a royalty of nature, and that frightens Macbeth. It's almost like, as Macbeth descends and declines further into evil, he becomes more frightened of virtues like goodness and loyalty and honesty and virtue. Now, one of the things that you might note as the play continues, Shakespeare has Macbeth behaving more and more like a tyrannical and cruel king. And even though this is a play which was written in the early 17th century, the character of Macbeth behaves very much like 20th century dictators like Stalin and Hitler behaved. He starts to rewrite history to suit his own paranoia and his own version of events. He says this of Banquo, "'Tis much he dares, and to that dauntless temper of his mind he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valour to act in safety." When he says of Banquo, "'Tis much he dares," he's accusing Banquo of wanting the kingship for himself. He's accusing Banquo of being so ambitious that he wants to take the crown from Macbeth, but that's not true. Banquo isn't interested in becoming king. He's just delighted that his own sons will become king in future. So Macbeth is twisting the facts and distorting the facts to suit his own purposes. It's almost like he's building up a character assassination of Banquo to justify what he's going to do to him. We also see that other reasons that Macbeth is frightened of Banquo. Banquo has a dauntless temper of his mind. Banquo is not easily frightened, and we've already had examples of that earlier in the play. Remember when Banquo stood up to the witches when Macbeth was frightened of them? One of the reasons that Macbeth wants to get rid of Banquo and why he fears him is because Banquo is not a man who is easy to intimidate. He has a dauntless temper of his mind. Another reason that Macbeth is so against Banquo is because in Macbeth's words, he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valour to act in safety. Banquo is a wise man. We, the audience, have seen that for ourselves. Remember, it was Banquo who advised Macbeth not to be too trusting of the witches. Banquo also has the wisdom at this point in the play to see through Macbeth and to become suspicious of him. So maybe some of Macbeth's fears are founded, but if Macbeth was acting in a virtuous and honest manner, he would have nothing to fear from Banquo. The reason he fears Banquo is because Banquo represents in many ways all of the things that Macbeth is steadily losing. Another key quotation here which emphasises something Macbeth has already said: "There is none but he whose being I do fear. I am frightened of no one except Banquo." It's a further line that confirms Macbeth's insecurity. "And under him my genius is rebuked, as it is said Mark Antony's was by Caesar." Don't be too worried about the historical reference here to Rome. Shakespeare wrote a number of plays set in Rome, including one called Julius Caesar and one called Antony and Cleopatra, but you don't need to worry too much about that. What I would like you to note is the fact that he says of Banquo, "Under him my genius is rebuked." I interpret this line as Macbeth saying, Next to Banquo, I look stupid. Because Banquo is wise and is perceptive, Macbeth feels stupid next to him. Now, a key thing to note at this point is that at the beginning of the play, Macbeth didn't reveal any of this because he didn't feel it. It's only since Macbeth's character has begun to decline that he is frightened of Banquo and all of his virtues. It's further paranoia, this fear that Macbeth has of looking stupid next to Banquo. And it's another of the reasons why he wants to get rid of him. Under him, my genius is rebuked. There's another little example here of Macbeth rewriting history to suit his own ends. He says this: "He," meaning Banquo, "chid the sisters when first they put the name of king upon me, and bade them speak to him." He chid the sisters. He told off, he scolded, he shouted at the witches when they gave me these wonderful prophecies. No, he didn't. If you remember, Banquo spoke really quite civilly and politely to the witches and only asked for prophecies of his own when Macbeth stood there too startled to say anything else. Banquo stood up to the witches. He did not shout at them because they'd given Macbeth brilliant prophecies. This is another example of Macbeth's paranoia, and he's rewriting, if you like, history in order to suit his version of events. But Macbeth is not being entirely honest here. "Then, prophet-like, they hailed him father to a line of kings." And it's this that's really revealing Macbeth's own insecurity. It's the prophecy that the witches gave Banquo that becomes the source of his paranoia. He elaborates further. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren sceptre in my grip, thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding. Now we really get to the heart of Macbeth's paranoia. Not only is he angry with the prophecy that the witches gave Banquo, it's the insecurity of the fact that upon my head they, the witches, placed a fruitless crown. If something is fruitless, it is pointless, it is futile. But also, fruit is used as a metaphor for children and new life. One of the reasons that Macbeth's crown is fruitless in both senses is that, in a way, Macbeth becoming king is pointless and futile. One, because the position is not rightly his, and two, he's murdered to get it. And it's also true in the second sense, because Macbeth has no heir, no son to pass the crown to, then he is also fruitless in that respect. He has no children, so the name of Macbeth will not last upon the throne. He talks about a barren sceptre being put in his grip. Now, a sceptre is a long rod of metal, usually made of gold and ornately decorated with jewels. A sceptre is a symbol of power. It's a symbol of royalty and kingship. The key quotation here is the fact that Macbeth describes metaphorically this sceptre that's been put in his grip as barren. Barren meaning sterile. It's another reference from Macbeth to the fact that he has no children to take the crown from him when he dies or when it's time for him to move on. And he is angry with the thought that the crown will be wrenched, taken away by force from him by an unlineal hand, someone who is not in line for the throne, no son of mine succeeding. It really bothers Macbeth that he's got no child of his own to pass the crown to. Macbeth's frustration boils over in the final part of the speech. If it be so, in other words, if the prophecies of the witches to Banquo are going to come true, for Banquo's issue have I filed my mind. For Banquo's children, for Banquo's descendants, I have defiled, meaning corrupted or ruined my mind. I have destroyed my own mental health. I have destroyed my own peace of mind. For Banquo's sake, not for my sake, but for the sake of Banquo's children. For them, the gracious Duncan, have I murdered, put rankers in the vessel of my peace only for them, and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man to make them kings, the seeds of Banquo kings. So put simply, I have corrupted my own mind and soul for Banquo's children's benefit. Because here I am on the throne having done all of this hard work, and it's pointless. Remember the line that started this speech, to be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. He ends his speech like this. Rather than so come fate into the list and champion me to the utterance. Right, well, I'd just better get on with things, hadn't I? I will face fate, I will face whatever destiny has in store for me, and I will fight it. The speech ends with the very prosaic, who's there? And the servant comes back in, bringing with him the two men who are described in the script as murderers. Macbeth says to the servant, now go to the door and stay there till we call. He obviously wants the servant to keep watch. Off the servant goes, and Macbeth says to the two murderers, Was it not yesterday we spoke together? This proves that Macbeth has been planning Banquo's murder for some time. He spoke to these men yesterday. The murderers say together, "It was, so please your highness." Yes, it was indeed yesterday. Macbeth then says, "Well then, now have you considered of my speeches? Have you considered the things that I talked to you about yesterday? Know that it was he in the times past which held you so under fortune, which you thought had been our innocent self. This I made good to you in our last conference." So, how has Macbeth managed to convince these two murderers that Banquo needs to be killed? Well, firstly, I want to raise an important point here, and this will be borne out by some evidence later on in this scene. Although in the script these two men are described as murderers, that's really just for convenience. That's really just to make it easier for a director of the play to understand who these men are. I want you, as students, to understand these two men are not professional killers. They are not hired assassins. They are two men who are the lowest of the low in this society. Two men whom life has not treated very well. They are poor, they have no status, they have no power, and they are taking on this job to earn a little bit of money, and probably because they are frightened of what Macbeth will do to them if they don't go along with his instructions. So don't imagine that these two men are professional assassins or professional killers. They are just two men down on their luck who are doing it out of fear and money. That's one of the reasons why Macbeth has to do some persuading. Because these are not professional killers, he can't just rock up at the nearest tavern, especially not as king, and say, "Right, I need two men to do a killing for me." He's got to persuade these two ordinary citizens that Banquo must die. And the way that he's done that, remember what I've just said, these are two men who are the lowest of the low in society. Macbeth has convinced them that it is Banquo, as a lord, as a thane, who is responsible for the position that they find themselves in. That Banquo has been a corrupt thane, that he's been greedy, that he's taken all of the money in the realm of Scotland that he rules, all to himself, and that's why these two men have nothing. That's why these two men are poor and destitute and living in hardship. He also says something which I think is important when we're considering Macbeth's character. He says to them, "Know that it was he, Banquo, in the times past, which held you so under fortune," and it's this bit, "which you thought had been our innocent self." Now, why would these two men have blamed Macbeth in the past for their hardship and their poverty? The answer to that question, I think, and bearing in mind this is my interpretation and evaluation, there could be others, but what it says to me as a reader or as a member of the audience is that maybe in the past, when Macbeth was Thane of Glamis, maybe he has always been somewhat dishonest. Maybe he has always been somewhat corrupt. Otherwise, why would these two men, these subjects, these citizens, why would they have thought that Macbeth was responsible for their hardship and poverty? It just sets a little alarm bell ringing in my imagination. Maybe what Shakespeare's doing here is giving us the hint that even though in the first scenes of the play, where Macbeth is being described as noble and valiant, yes, he is a brave warrior, yes, he has fought bravely for his king, but maybe as Thane of Glamis, he wasn't always a particularly kind and compassionate lord, and that he treated his subjects with contempt, maybe then he has form for being a corrupt ruler. It's just that as a lord, he didn't have as much power as he now has as king. So much so that now he's trying to convince these two men that it wasn't me who was responsible for your poverty and hardship, it's actually Banquo. This I made good to you in our last conference, passed in probation with you, how you were borne in hand, how crossed, the instruments who wrought with them, and all things else that might to half a soul and to a notion craze say, thus did Banquo. So Banquo is responsible for all of your hardship. The first murderer says, you made it known to us. Yep, indeed, that is what you told us yesterday. Macbeth then says, I did so and went further, which is now our point of second meeting. Do you find your patience so predominant in your nature that you can let this go? Are you so gospelled to pray for this good man and for his issue, whose heavy hand hath bowed you to the grave and beggared yours forever? So Macbeth is saying here, the reason I've given you overnight to think about this is because I now put to you this question. Knowing that it is Banquo who is to blame for the position you find yourself in, can you let this go? Can you really let Banquo get away with this? Are you so gospelled, are you so holy that you would pray for him and his children when he has bowed you to the grave and beggared yours forever? Can you pray for the very man who has ruined your lives and the lives of your children? So all of this is designed to turn these men against Banquo and convince them to take this job that Macbeth is offering them to have Banquo killed. The first murderer replies, we are men, my liege. In other words, when he says we are men, we are courageous. We will stand up to Banquo and we will prove that we are men. Now, this next speech from Macbeth is quite long, but forgive me, Shakespeare, a lot of it is waffle, and it's actually quite easily analysed. So don't be put off if you feel yourself a bit confused by this. I'll try and make it easy for you at the end. So the first murderer says, we are men, my liege, to which Macbeth replies, Aye, in the catalogue ye go for men, as hounds and greyhounds, mongrels, spaniels, curs, shoughs, water rugs, and demi-wolves are clept all by the name of dogs. The valued file distinguishes the swift, the slow, the subtle, the housekeeper, the hunter, every one according to the gift which bounteous nature hath in him closed, whereby he does receive particular addition from the bill that writes them all alike, and so of men. Now, if you have a station in the file not in the worst rank of manhood, say it, and I will put that business in your bosoms, whose execution takes your enemy off, grapples you to the heart, and love of us who were our health but sickly in his life, which in his death were perfect. What's that all about? When the first murderer says, we are men, my liege, Macbeth actually insults them, and this really shows you what type of a king Macbeth is and how different he is from Duncan. Duncan, remember, a kind and compassionate and loving ruler who would treat his subjects well and with honesty and with integrity. What does the new king Macbeth do? He belittles these men. When the first murderer says, we are men, my liege, Macbeth turns to him and says, oh yes, you call yourself men. But there are many different kinds of men in the same way that there are many different kinds of dogs. And each man, just like each dog, each type of dog, is given a role and a station in life. I can't help but read what Macbeth says here as if he's comparing these men to dogs. And he's also reminding them of their low status in society. That's your role in society. It's like he's saying to them, you call yourself men, but you're actually the lowest of the low. he is being really rather cruel by putting them down at this stage, but he is still able to convince them that Banquo needs to die. At the end of this speech, Macbeth refers to the fact that while Banquo lives, Macbeth feels sick. His life is sickly. But everything will be perfect if his death, Banquo's death, is carried out. Now, here is your evidence from the murderers themselves that they are the lowest of the low in society. The second murderer says, I am one, my liege, whom the vile blows and buffets of the world hath so incensed that I am reckless what I do to spite the world. Put simply, I am one, your majesty, who has suffered a great deal in this life. I've had vile blows, all sorts of adversity, and I'm so incensed, I'm so annoyed with how rubbish my life is, that I am reckless, I am careless what I do to spite the world. I am careless, I am reckless as to what I will do to get revenge on the world. The first murderer says, and I another, so weary with disasters, tugged with fortune, that I would set my life on any chance to mend it or be rid on it. So I have had enough of my life as well. I want my life to get better. I've had enough of all of the disasters and the misfortune that I've had to go through. So I will do anything, either to end my life and stop this pain, or do something that will allow me to mend it, to make it better. So Macbeth, wanting to confirm that he has these men on his side, both of you know Banquo was your enemy. And the murderers say, true, my lord, so they have been convinced. Macbeth replies, so is he mine, and in such bloody distance that every minute of his being thrusts against my nearest of life. And though I could, with barefaced power, sweep him from my sight and bid my will avouch it, yet I must not. For certain friends that are both his and mine, whose loves I may not drop, but wail his fall, who I myself struck down. And thence it is that I to your assistance do make love, masking the business from the common eye, for sundry weighty reasons. In this speech, Macbeth explains to the murderers why he won't kill Banquo himself. Macbeth boasts that though I could with barefaced power sweep him from my sight, he says, yet I must not. The reason he gives, for certain friends that are both his and mine, whose loves I may not drop, but wail his fall, who I myself struck down. Even though I am powerful enough to kill Banquo myself, I don't want to do it because Banquo and I have friends in common. We have mutual friends who would be angry with me if I killed Banquo because they don't fully understand my reasons and motives. So therefore, I've got to keep all of these other men on my side. That's why I want this murder done privately. That's why I'm not going to do it myself. I just want to raise the issue here that with Macbeth hiring these two men to kill Banquo, it shows us that Macbeth is now contemplating murder with no doubts whatsoever. Just remember how hesitant he was to kill Duncan. Now, all of that hesitancy has gone. He is a changed man. This time, notice, he will not commit the murder himself. And we could suggest that makes him more of a coward. What he does is he hires these two disillusioned, desperate men to do his dirty work for him. This time, he does not want to commit the deed himself. And he even goes so far as to make this excuse to these men, that the reason I want you to do it is because I don't want to end up falling out, or rather have other lords fall out with me, because they like Banquo, I don't, and they don't understand the reasons why I dislike Banquo. That's why I want the murder done in secret. The second murderer says, "We shall, my lord, perform what you command us." The first murderer tries to show his enthusiasm by saying, though our lives, and we assume that he's going to commit himself completely loyally to Macbeth, but Macbeth can't be bothered listening to him anymore. He cuts across him, he interrupts him. "Your spirits shine through you. Within this hour, at most, I will advise you where to plant yourselves. I will tell you where you need to be in order to meet with Banquo and kill him. Acquaint you with the perfect spy of the time, the moment on it, for it must be done tonight. And something from the palace. Always thought that I require a clearness." So he's giving the very clear command, Banquo must die tonight, and you must make sure that you kill him, in Macbeth's words, something from the palace, far away from the palace. The reason being, Macbeth says that I require a clearness. I do not want to make it look like I've had anything to do with Banquo's death. That's why I want him murdered far away from the palace. If you think about it, there is a logic and an intelligence to what Macbeth is doing, despite the fact he's acting out of paranoia. If Banquo is killed far from the palace by two men who are the lowest of the low in society, it's going to look as if Banquo has been set upon by thieves or, murderers on the road. And so, therefore, it's not going to look like Macbeth had anything to do with it whatsoever. He's trying to make it look, I think, like a robbery that's gone wrong, and Banquo ends up killed out on the road, miles away from the palace, and then nobody's going to think Macbeth had anything to do with it at all. Then, Macbeth adds something else to the plot. "And with him, to leave no rubs nor botches in the work, Fleance, his son that keeps him company, whose absence is no less material to me than is his father's, must embrace the fate of that dark hour. Resolve yourselves apart, I'll come to you anon." To which the murderers reply, "We are resolved, my lord." Macbeth says, "I'll call upon you straight, abide within." The murderers are dismissed, and Macbeth concludes the scene. "It is concluded. Banquo, thy soul's flight, if it find heaven, must find it out tonight." Now we just need to retrace our steps a little bit. When, towards the end of the scene, Macbeth says to the murderers that not only does he want Banquo killed, he wants Banquo's son Fleance killed as well. Fleance, whose absence is no less material to me, must embrace the fate of that dark hour. That is Macbeth's rather poetic way of saying, I want Fleance killed as well. Now, just before we finish the analysis of this scene, I want to raise an important issue with you. We know that it is Banquo's children who will become kings in Scotland in the future, not Banquo himself. Therefore, Banquo has never been a threat to Macbeth. If there is any threat to Macbeth at all, it comes from Banquo's children. Therefore, Macbeth's judgment is clouded by his paranoia. He prioritizes the murder of Banquo. He emphasizes to these two murderers that Banquo must die. Then, almost as an afterthought, he says, and I want Fleance dead as well. He says that Fleance's absence, meaning murder, is no less material to me. Fleance's murder is no less important to me than the murder of his father, Banquo. But when you think about it, if Macbeth was thinking clearly, Fleance should have been the priority for the killing, because Banquo is not a rival to Macbeth's power, but Fleance is, and Banquo's other children in the future. So I think it is very telling, and Shakespeare does this deliberately. It is very telling, I think, that what Shakespeare's doing is he's demonstrating how Macbeth's judgment is clouded by his paranoia. He's not thinking clearly. He orders and emphasises the killing of Banquo and then adds Fleance as an afterthought, when really Fleance should have been his first and primary target. I also believe, and I'll talk about this in a later tutorial, I think that that is one of the reasons why Shakespeare has it that Macbeth does not tell his wife about this murder, because Macbeth does not really have any logical motive for killing Banquo. And I think the reason he doesn't share it with Lady Macbeth is because the inference is that Lady Macbeth would say, well, what do you want Banquo killed for? Why is that important? So Macbeth is following his own agenda, and his agenda is not a logical one. But as I say, that will become more apparent in later scenes. Our next tutorial will focus on two scenes from Act 3, scenes 2 and 3. And that's because Act 3, scene 3, the scene which deals with Banquo's murder, is rather short. And so that can be dealt with alongside Act 3, Scene 2. So I will see you for that tutorial in the near future.